What is up, YouTube? It's your boy Millsy, back with Hometown Commander, and we are back for another episode of Personal Brews, the show where I brew decks first look for myself. These are decks that are intended to be tested by myself, but I also want to share them with you so you guys can see what I'm personally brewing for myself, what I'm interested in myself. I don't want everything that I brew on the channel just to be for you guys. Some of it I want to be be a little bit selfish and brew for me as well. But I thought, why not show you guys what's in my brain? What am I brewing for myself? Not only what am I brewing for you guys, but what am I brewing for myself? And today we have a really fun episode. Xenagos, God of Revels, Gruul, Good Times, and this is a deck type that I have been kind of rotating around for a long time. I've had this idea that this deck idea started back when Nath of the Dire Hunt came out in the original Jumpstart with a deck called Gruul Fight Club. The idea of the deck was a Gruul deck that cares about combat, cares about winning in combat or fighting with your opponent's creatures, and just gaining and prospering off value in the combat step. And it's taken a bunch of different forms over time, but I think I've finally wrapped it back around to a place where I like it. I've tried plenty of commanders in the slot for this deck, but I think my favorite commander that I've tried so far is still Xenagos. This is a creature that allows us to, at the beginning of combat on our turn, give another creature we control haste and +X till end of turn, where X is that creature's power. And the great part about that is it's that creature, not Xenagos. Doesn't matter what power and toughness Xenagos is, although it starts as a 6/5 and it's a pretty great beater on its own. It can make a lot of the giant creatures in our deck even worse to deal with when we get into combat. It's indestructible, and then just like every other Theros god, if our devotion to red and green is less than 7, Xenagos isn't a creature, it's just an enchantment at that point. So the cool part is Xenagos does not need to come down as a creature to use his ability. In fact, most of the time when Xenagos comes down, it will not be a creature. It will come down as an enchantment. For the purposes of spells and abilities, it is a creature spell on the stack. Whether it comes down as a creature, that's something that trips people up sometimes because it isn't considered to be a creature once it hits the battlefield. But once it hits the battlefield, you can't plowshares it or path to exile it. If it's not considered to be a creature, it's not a creature on the battlefield. But on the stack, it would consider to be a creature spell. So Gruul aggro or Gruul combats is what we're trying to do. But the real goal of this deck is to try to go infinite with combats. In the Gruul colors, we have lots of trample enablers and different things to pump our board. In fact, in this deck alone, we have multiple creatures that will double the power and toughness of our creatures. In combat, we have creatures that will let us go infinite with combats, who will let us have more combats if they deal combat damage to a player. We have creatures that are going to give us a massive amount of value, creatures that will deal... When we deal damage to an opponent, we deal damage to all opponents. There are plenty of creatures in the deck that are going to give us value. And the goal for the deck is to hit hard quick, get mana down as best we can. I've chose to forego a lot of the 1 mana dorks you normally see in Xenagos for straight ramp, because what I want to do is when I get Xenagos down, I want to have a creature down before him, but I also don't want to let off the gas. I want to have enough mana to just blitz and keep going once Xenagos comes down. Land base, I'm going with the Snowlands to play the 1 piece of extra ramp, and that is... Into the north can go get any snowland and put it into play tapped. This can go get both our Highland forest and all of our snowlands. So the cool part about that is we can go get a duel with it, or we can go get a basic land. So if you think about it in that sense, we're kind of playing 2 rampant growth and Into the North, because both of them can go get basic lands in our deck, as well as we're playing your normal green ramp. So the Saga's in here because we are playing some more expensive cards in this deck. Remember, this is a deck built for myself, so I'm using some more expensive enchantments and artifacts. So Urza's Soccer is in here for that. Nykthos is in here because as soon as we go wide, we want to use Nykthos to create lots of mana to get more and more things down. This isn't a deck that's just going to win with Craterhoof. We really want to absolutely overrun our opponents with creature value. And there's a couple ways we're going to do that. The one is Sneak Attack. Sneak Attack's a card that doesn't see a lot of play in most decks, but I think in this deck specifically, when we're playing with so many expensive big creatures, Sneak Attack is going to help us end the game. For a red, we can put a creature card from our hand on the battlefield. It gains haste, and we sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. Well, if we're putting down big enough things, and we give those things haste with this, or we can pump them up with any other sort of ability. It doesn't matter, they get sacrificed to beginning of the next end step. If we can sneak attack into an an infinite combats combo, it doesn't matter whether they get sacrificed at the end step, right? If we can go off and knock players out that way, it won't matter. And again, that is the intention of this deck. We're playing Utopia Sprawl and Wild Growth for some extra ramp. Sylvan Library to help us with the draw. Survival of the Fittest is going to let us filter the creatures we don't want and go get the creatures we do want. Survival of the Fittest is the most expensive card in this deck. That's because it's a card I have in the staple binder, so I'm willing to brew with it. It's a card that probably doesn't need to be in the deck, but I think it's one of the things that could make the deck better and hit a little bit more consistency in the mid game if you see it, allowing you to kind of search a little bit better. We're playing the Worldly Tutors of the World, sure, but Survival of the Fittest is almost better because we can do it at instant speed and go do, discard that creature, get one into our hand, and get it ready to go ahead and sneak attack, or do this on our opponent's turn to prepare our hand for the next step. We have Shadow of the Warp, which is going to drop not only Xenagos' cost, but drop the first creature we cast each turn. This is great because it's going to allow us to get those 3 to 6 mana creatures down a little bit quicker and a little bit cheaper. Rhythm of the Wild, one of the best Gruul enchantments as far as creature decks go, because your creature spells can't be countered, and every non-token creature you control either gets a +1/+1 counter or haste. So you get your choice, and I think that's pretty important because there are going to be times where we don't necessarily want to go right in right away, so we're willing to take the +1/+1 counter and kind of wait, or if we just have one creature in Xenagos, well, we can take the +1/+1 counter because Xenagos is just going to give that creature haste. So it kind of opens up the options for them in the wild. Garruk's Uprising and Elemental Bond are both in here for card draw, but of course, Garruk's Uprising also gives us trample. Xenagos does not naturally give that creature trample. It only gives that creature haste. So the good part about these trample enablers, we want a few of them in here so that we can make sure we're hitting hard. We're not just putting down creatures that don't. And then Agasol and Bear Umbra pair with Sword of Feast and Famine for one way that we can take infinite combats. Bear Umbra says when this creature attacks, untap all lands you control. Sword of Feast and Famine says when this creature deals combat damage to player, that player discards a card and untap all lands you control. And then Agasol says for 5 mana we can tap all creatures we control, and after this main phase there's an additional combat followed by an additional main phase. Basically what this means is with Bear Umbra, as long as it attacks and survives combat, which is going to be pretty easy with Xenagos. If we're doubling the same creature that has Bear Umbra on it, it's going to get massive as well. Because remember, Xenagos goes off every combat. It doesn't say at the start of your first combat on your turn. It says the start of combat on your turn means every combat is a new Xenagos trigger as well. Agasol's a great way for us to end the game that way. Shadow Spear in here for just a little bit of help punching through, but also gives that creature lifelink, which means if we have a 24/24 or 40/40 creature and we dump a Shadow Spear onto it, we're gaining that life as well as far as punching through for it. So Shadow Spear is going to help us hit through for that, and this is another target for Urza's Saga. If we don't need the Soul Ring, we don't need the Crypt, we can go ahead and use Urza's Saga to get the Shadow Spear to kind of help us on our board. Great Henge, one of the best single artifacts in a creature deck. It's going to give us +1/+1 counters and draw us card every time our creatures come down. The cool part is with Sneak Attack, it'll trigger the Great Henge, because the Great Henge doesn't say cast, it just says whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield. So we'll talk about when we get up to our creatures. There are a couple creatures that will put creatures in tapped and attacking. That will trigger Great Henge and allows them to get a counter and draw a card. And then Arcane Signet, Crypt, and Soul Ring for our mana artifacts. I normally don't play Mana Crypt and Soul Ring in most green creature decks because most of the time you want green mana more than anything else. And I would have probably done that here, but I think the difference here is we want to get Xenagos out ahead of time if possible. And so really the 3 mana slot is full up with a couple mana dorks with upside that are coming down, and the same thing with our 4 mana slot. We want to make sure either of those can come down early before we get Xenagos down. That way Xenagos has a target to trigger or to get when it comes down. Spells. The spells in this deck are pretty bare bone. It's pretty much just ramp and protection and destruction. So for ramp, Cultivate, Into the North, Nature's Lore, Rampant Growth, 3 visits. I thought about Cultivate, but to be honest, I figured with Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl, we may not need it, as well as the Shadow and the Warp as a way for a little bit of reduction. Blasphemous Act is there for a little bit, is our trusted board wipe in the deck. Finale of Devastation, one of our finishers. With Finale of Devastation, as long as we get either a creature that gives all of our creatures trample, or we get Crater Hoof or a lot of other things, Finale Devastation will very quickly end games due to how big your creatures get when you put more than 10 mana into this. Jessica's Will can put us a little bit up on mana. Triumph of the Hordes to help us end the game as well. If we can't go the alternate combats route, the infinite combats route, but we have enough power on board to end the game, Triumph of the Hordes is going to help us do that. Natural Order, one of my favorite creature spells, my spells for creature decks, because in this deck, so many of our creatures are green, including the other things that can make creature tokens. Those creature tokens are green, which means we can sacrifice those in natural order to go get any green creature of our choice and put it on the battlefield. This can go get Crater Hoof. This also can just go get a lot of other things. Those things could be targets for Xenagos. Those things could be targets to help us win the game. There's plenty of choices we have here for natural order. No, you don't get the upside of Finale Devastation for pumping your board, but let's be honest, if you natural order for a Crater Hoof, whether you have Triumph of the Hordes or anything like that, you probably are going to have the chance to knock at least one player out, and that's the goal. Instance, this is going to look kind of weird. I think the Heroic Intervention looks normal, the Beast Within looks normal. The crop rotation is here for Yavimaya, and that is because there are some cards in our deck that care about how many forests we have, and so being able to get the Yavimaya either out when we see it or crop rotation for the Yavimaya is pretty good for that. Crop rotation also can go get Nykthos. It can get Urza Saga. What I like about crop rotation is it can go get the land we think we might need and put it on the battlefield. Force of Vigor, this is one of our more expensive pieces of removal. If it's not our turn, we can exile a green card from our hand rather than play the spell's cost, destroy up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments. And this is our combo protection. When you start getting up into higher power tables, you start to realize that combos happen at instant speed. And I think Force of Vigor is one of those cards that's going to kind of help us try our best to stop them, even when our opponents may not think we might be able to. Hunter's Insight, gonna draw us a bunch of cards, because with that Xenagos pump, there's a good chance we're going to trample over and deal some good damage to somebody, and Hunter's Insight's going to give us that little piece of draw, and then Worldly Tutor, of course, just to do a little bit more searching. So one of the big reasons I had crop rotation and in here originally was because I was trying to play the new Nissa, of course, the one that pumps your board for the number of forests you control. I might try to work that card back in, but I took it out because I was worried that we had too many things on the higher end, and I wanted to throw a few Planeswalkers in on the mid end. So we're going to talk about the Planeswalkers first, then we'll get into the creatures. Domri Anarchibulus, 3 mana, all of our creatures get a flat little pump of +1/+0. We can add a red or green, and creature spells you control can't be countered this turn, so this is going to shut off people from interacting to our creatures while they're on the stack. And then -2, a creature we control fights another creature we don't control. I think Domri's a great thing we want to play on like turn 2 if we're ramping, or turn 3. This could potentially get us into Xenagos quicker. It allows us to just put more things down on the battlefield and give our creatures a buff. The fight comes in more often than you think it will, as far as clearing the way for some things. If you have an opponent who only has 1 creature or has a pretty big creature and your creature's already big enough anyway, you can fight through it and get yourself there for that damage. We're trying out the new Luca. This is the card that I'm trying over Nissa because I think this fits a very similar role to Domri. And so I want to try this first, and if this Luca doesn't work out, then I think I will probably pull that Nissa back in. Luca, Bound to Ruin, the +1, add red and a green, spend this mana to only cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. That's going to come in handy as all of our creatures are going to be bigger. -1 gives us a 3/3 beast with Toxic 1. That's great because it can just give us a body, and again, it is green for the purposes of natural order. And then -4 deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers, so not players, just creatures, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control as you activated this ability. This is great because, 1, it says when you activated the ability. So if we do this picking something that got, let's say our Galta got doubled by Xenagos, so it's a 24, and after combat we pick Galta and someone tries to destroy the Galta in response to try to get rid of this trigger, it's not going to happen. It's when it gets activated, we've already targeted it. So it's going to go through and deal that 24 damage, just decide to we choose among that. More often than not, this is going to be another mini board wipe that we have access to, with just how big our creatures are going to be. And then Vivian, Monsters Advocate, my single favorite planeswalker for creatures decks. So we can look at the top card of our library at any time. This is great because we know what we're drawing. If we don't have Sylvan Library, this kind of helps us see what's coming off the top. We can cast creatures from the top of our library. This is great because it kind of extends our hand a card, right? It extends our hand 1 card into the deck. +1 makes a 3/3 beast with our choice of Vigilance, Reach, or Trample. Well, this is great because, again, this is another body that we can get out if we need to. Xenagos could give it haste, or this is another body for natural order that we can use to not lose a creature that we had to care about. But the -2 is where this Vivian shines, and where I think until you see it happen in a game, you don't realize how good this ability is. Whenever you cast your next creature spell this turn, search your library for a creature card with lesser converted mana cost, or now would be mana value. Put it onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. Okay, so the next time we cast a creature spell after we activate this ability, we look at that creature's mana value, and we can get a creature with less than it from our deck. Well, I'm going to spoil this for you. The best creature to pair this with is Ghalta. Ghalta is a 12 mana value creature that we can cast for double green if we have enough power on the battlefield. Well, for the purposes of Vivian's ability, this is a 12 mana value creature, which means we can get literally anything out of our library. Now, most of the time that's Craterhoof, right? This is a way to end the game. Do that. But more often than not, I go after targets like Old Gnawbone, and things like that, where you're going to go get something that's just going to give you value, even if it can't attack this turn. And we have a couple of these cards like Terror of the Peaks and Old Gnawbone that just give a widespread value, even if they can't attack that turn. The cool part here is we could also go get something like Kiki Jiki, which is going to work into a couple of the combos we're going to talk about in a second with our creatures. So you can see the benefit of this Vivian depending on what we're casting. The really cool part is, remember, our commander is 5. So if we manage to get Vivian down before we cast Xenagos, well, now we know we can get anything 4 or less in our deck and get it for free. And we have a couple really important cards at 2 and 3 mana that we would want to go get with this if possible. The only downside is Vivian comes in at 3, so you would have to plus her up at least once if you want to be able to use this ability twice. But more often than not, I find myself bringing it in, plusing to give it a blocker to hopefully protect it, and then trying to get at least 1 or 2 good turns out of -2ing it for a good value. Okay, well, let's talk about our creatures. I want to talk about the mana dorks first that we're playing and why they're important. We'll talk about the big beaters. We'll do the combo creatures next, and then we'll talk about the other creatures in the deck. So our mana dorks of sorts, we have Goblin Archaeomancer. Each spell you cast that's red or green costs 1 less to cast. This means that we're going to make Xenagos even cheaper, and not only that, but every single card in our deck is going to be cheaper. So it kind of acts as a mini mana dork in the sense that it reduces the cost of our spells. We're also playing Goreclaw, a commander of a deck in its own right that I absolutely love, but this reduces the cost of our creatures with power 4 or greater as well, so we have a chance of even further reducing these creatures. Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, which came out in the Brothers War, taps for mana, but whenever we play a creature spell with power 5 or greater, we put a +1/+1 counter on it and untap it. This means that potentially, depending on how much mana we have and how big of a turn we're having, we can untap Gwenna multiple times and use her top ability to get mana. Renati, Behemoth Caller, says whenever we cast a creature spell with mana value 5 or greater, that creature enters the battlefield with X additional +1/+1 counters on it, where X is its mana value -4. So the bigger the creature, the more counters. And then it says creatures you control with 3 or more counters, +1/+1 counters on them, have haste. This is great because remember, Great Henge puts counter on. There's a couple things in our deck like Rhythm of the Wild, right? You can put +1/+1 counters on, but more often than not, Runati's just going to take the giant creatures coming in and give them haste plus a power buff. And that's great because then it's going to get even worse for our opponent, and it can just straight tap for a green. And then Selvala, probably the best of the 3. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield, if its controller may draw a card if it has the power greater than every other creature's power. This is going to happen for us more often than not, just due to how big some of our creatures are. And then green in to tap it, add X mana in any combination of colors, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control. As soon as we dump that Ghalta, as soon as we dump that Hydra Omnivore, whatever else we can get our hands on, this is going to tap for a giant amount of mana, and it's going to make those turns where we hopefully try to go infinite or go in to finish the game even better. So I'm choosing to run these 4 on Goreclaw over the Elvish Mystics and the Llanowar Elves of the world, because I think more often than not, they're going to end up being more useful, and then some of these cards will actually be half decent in combat over some of those 1/1s in the grand scheme of things as well. Okay, well, let's get into our combo enablers now. We talked about our mana dorks. I said we were going to talk about our infinite combo enablers, and the first is Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker. This is going to be very well known to some players. And to some players, no one's going to know what this card is. Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker says, tap, put a creature token into play that's a copy of target non-legendary creature you control. That creature token has haste, sacrifice it at the end of the turn. Okay, so you have to pick a non-legendary creature, which eliminates some of the creatures in this creature pool because they're legendary, of course. and we get a copy of it. Okay, so the question becomes, what creatures would we want to copy? What creatures do we have that if we copied them would give us value? Well, the most common piece in red to copy, to provide this with, is Combat Celebrant. Combat Celebrant says if Combat Celebrant hasn't been exerted this turn, you may exert it as it attacks. That means it doesn't untap during your next turn if you choose to exert it. When you do, untap all other creatures you control, and after this phase, there's an additional combat phase. So the way this works is, the first turn, I have Kiki-Jiki, and Combat Celebrant needs to be able to attack, so maybe Xenagos would give it haste, or we've had it out for at least one turn. Combat Celebrant attacks, it exerts itself, and goes to untap all of my creatures. What this will do in a future iteration of this combo will untap Kiki-Jiki, but the first time, what we will do is tap Kiki-Jiki after this trigger goes off and copy Combat Celebrant. So now we have another copy of Combat Celebrant with haste. Combat Celebrant will attack in, and it doesn't even matter. It can actually die now in combat because we don't need the original anymore. Then the original Combat Celebrant is going to go off. It's going to have us additional combat phase. Well, now we're going to attack with the new Combat Celebrant that has haste because of Kiki-Jiki. Again, exerted again, it attacks. It untaps all the rest for creatures we control. We tap Kiki-Jiki again now that it's been untapped. Pick Combat Celebrant again. And you can see, you now have infinite combats. The best part about this is that even if your opponents have creatures, and unless they're an indestructible, you will basically just take an infinite amount of combats to win the game, because you're getting an infinite amount of, or near infinite amount of Combat Celebrants, as much as it would take to win the game, which means even if they have massive creatures, even if all their creatures are 100 hundreds, let's say all of their creatures are 100 hundreds and they have as many as you think, you will always be able to produce more combats than necessary to finish everyone off. It sounds insane, and I've never been at a board state where you've needed to take that many combats. But what I think is the best about this combo is that you have to remember, we're untapping all of these other creatures that we're attacking with, and some of them could be pretty massive. Some of them could be doing their own effects as well. It's not like these are the only two creatures on the battlefield. Hopefully we have other things on the battlefield, and we have other things that are affecting combat, like Morag, for example, which gives our creature +1/+0 for each time they've attacked this turn, and then if we landfall, we can get an additional combat. Well, the cool part about this is each of these combats is making our creatures bigger and bigger. Now, I've tried to kind of split my creatures between trample and flying and different things so that we can try to get around different board states, or give them just straight trample so they can knock through whatever's in front of us. But you can start to see that this is one of them. And then we have Bloodthirst. This creature, this is whenever it deals combat damage to a player, untap it. After this combat, there's an additional combat, but it can't attack a player that already attacked this turn. Well, with this, if we had, if we had Kiki-Jiki, we'd only be able to copy it once, right? Because Bloodthirster doesn't untap the rest of our creatures, so Kiki-Jiki wouldn't untap, but we could now have two of these with flying and trample attacking our opponents. Okay, well, that makes sense. Now we go down to Portraiser. Portraiser says when it deals combat damage to a player, untap each creature you control. After this combat phase, there's an additional combat phase, and then Portraiser can attack a player it has already attacked this turn. Well, with Kiki-Jiki, this means as long as one Portraiser connects first, and then we make a copy of that Portraiser, and each of those, the copy and the original, can hit a player that hasn't hit, or at least one of those two can hit someone that hasn't hit already, we can untap Kiki-Jiki, make another one, and keep this going. Yes, it's a mess to track, but I've found most of the time, once you make 5 or 6, your opponents are dead. This is a 4/4 that you're going to give trample, you're going to double it. If Xenagos is out, you're doubling this every time you make a new one, right? And so now they're 8/8s. Now they might potentially have trample. They have all of these abilities, and so we literally just need to hit a critical mass of creatures, and then once we can get into one of these loops, it's going to end the game. Savage Ventmaw, when it attacks, we get 3 red and 3 green. Well, this pairs with, and it doesn't go away between phases. This pairs with Agassault. This will give us enough mana to activate Agassault multiple times, and so now you can see that feeds into that feedback loop. Scourge of the Throne. If it attacks for the first time each turn, if it's attacking the player with the most life or tied for the most life, untap all creatures you control. After this, there's an additional combat phase. Well, this is a little bit harder, right? Because as soon as we start hitting a few opponents, we're going to have the most life. So Scourge of the Throne isn't as infinite as others, but it could be the thing that might lead off, at least getting us one additional combat, and that one additional combat may be enough. We have things like Zofindrel, which is going to double the power and toughness of all the creatures we control. We have things like Hydra Omnivore that says whenever it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. And we have lots of other creatures like this. Ilharg puts down creatures from our hand that are tapped and attacking. Then they go back to the hand at the beginning of the next end step. With extra combats with Ilharg, we could put our entire hand worth of creatures down on the battlefield attacking. Of course, we talked about Craterhoof being one of our finishers. Galt is a big boy. Tali exiles cards from the top of each player's library, and we get to cast them. The more combats we go, the more value we're getting. Quartzwood Crasher, whenever one or more creatures we control trample do damage to a player, we get an XX dinosaur creature token with trample where X is the amount of damage that's dealt to that player. Well, the cool part here is Quartzwood Crusher doesn't need to attack. If we're in one of these combat loops with Kiki Jiki and we hit somebody with trample and we have Xenagos out, now we're making XX tokens that we can double and give haste and get them involved in combat. The entire goal of this deck is to get creatures involved in combat and to blow our opponents out in combat. That's it. Full stop. That's the whole goal of this deck. That's what it's built to do. Now, the only qualm I have about this deck is, can I do it consistently? That's the honest question, right? Can we do it consistently enough to rely on as a game plan? I think we can. I think we have plenty of ways like Ancient Copper Dragon and Old Gnawbone to provide us mana back. We have Klauth, who's going to give us a crap ton of mana as well to do this. I think we have it. I think we can do it. The question just becomes, is the deck consistent enough to do it? And that's where the test comes through. It's not the concept. I think the concept of this deck works. I've done this with less support. You know what I mean? So I know the concept works. The question is this specific build consistent enough? And that's what I expect to change over time, is how do we get it more consistent? Can we sub individual creatures out for other creatures to, or do we need to add more ramp? Do we need to add unnatural growth as well as Zofindrel to double our creatures' power and toughnesses to really get through for that extra damage? You know, where are we lacking in the effects that we need in the deck? Because there's always more trample enablers we can add. There's always more extra, just straight up extra combat spells we can add. There's plenty of things that we can add, but the question becomes, where is our inconsistency in the way that the deck runs? Because that's truly what we need to test here, in my opinion. I think the strategy is sound. I think the creature choices are sound. The question just becomes, how do we organize our turn structure? How do we play the things we need to play? And do we have enough pieces to do it? And if we don't, then we come back to the drawing board. We swap some cards out, right? And we make it work. The other thing I love about this deck is this deck can play almost any red or green creature you really want it to play. Magic's taught me one thing over the time I've been playing, which is that every couple sets, a new green creature or a massive green creature is going to come out that's going to make you want to play with it. And although this deck might get a little bit pickier than Goreclaw about what green creatures it can play, I think it still wants to try them as long as they kind of usurp another slot that this deck is looking for. We're probably not going to be replacing the Combat Celebrants and the Port Razors and those kind of cards in this deck. But we are completely willing to replace an Atali or a Hydra Omnivore if we get better creatures in slot. You know, we're trying out Tyrannix Rex in here just to see if it does me enough good on its own. The kind of cool part about this is if we have infinite combats without Kiki Jiki, we could just make infinite copies of Tyrannix Rex and win the game that way because it has Toxic 4 and Trample, right? So there's Kiki Jiki can go plenty infinite with other things if there's other ways to get the infinite combats rolling. But I'm just intrigued to see if it is the laser beam that I expect it to be, of course, and if it does what I want it to do. But let me know what you think down in the comments. I would love to know what you think of the Xenagos list. Is the extra combats thing something you're interested in, or is it not? Again, this is probably version 8.0 of the idea that was Gruul Fight Club a long time ago. But I've just loved this deck archetype, and I think the more and more I try new things, the more and more I come back to this idea for a Gruul Combats deck that can end the game, that can throw its weight around, and can have a good time. Drop me a like if you want to see more brews. I'm trying to out-brew your favorite Magic channel, and subscribe if you want to see some more content, and I will catch you next time.